Namaste. First of all, I'm so happy that we have a subject like the relevance of Arjuna on the battlefield of life. Uh, it has always been as a child, when I grew up with Mahabharata and Ramayana, it was an enigma to me that how come these epics have endured the rub and change of time right up to today's time. They carry not only a relevance, but so much we can derive from them. And then, of course, reading all through the webs and mazes of psychology, what I discovered is that these epics have been written with such a marvelous sense, wherein all the archetypes of human nature we find in the Mahabharata. Of course, in the Ramayana also, but in the Mahabharata. So their relevance is going to be universal and for future time to come. Because they are about human nature in all the various shades. And if we want to understand human psychology, human beings, human personality, one of the best books is Mahabharata. One of my students, being a psychiatrist, somebody asked me that, where to read psychology from, best book. So I spontaneously replied, and I would still say the same, read the Mahabharata. And you will know all about human psychology in a much better way than all the standard textbooks, which are so much, they are disconnected with life. You have human personality described as a cluster of things and all. But in the Mahabharata, we see these archetypes naturally, organically growing in life. We can connect with them without labeling them. And not only we can connect with them, they show the path that each archetype takes and its inevitable consequence. For instance, we see Karna, a capable person who is in every way a wonderful, both a human being and a capable person. But what happens to him is ambition takes the better of him. And because of that, in spite of being so capable, in spite of being, even a wonderful human being, he meets his nemesis going through the road of, wanting to skip the steps and wanting to jump through, the need for a quick success, the need for outer name and fame. So these are very fascinating stories. And among all of them, we see the hero. Of course, the hero is Shri Krishna, but he is the invisible king, the hero of the epic, Arjuna, who is in the forefront, in the middle of the battlefield. So, who really is Arjuna? What makes him really such a disciple that he can receive the teaching of the Gita? The setting is very interesting. Now, of course, we teach the Gita in ashramas, and there are big lectures, seminars. People talk about each mantra and they try to understand the Sanskrit. But look at the setting of the Gita. It is given in the middle of the battlefield. And when is it given? There are a lot of equally competent warriors, equally dharmanist people in the battlefield. There is Bhishma, there is Yudhishthir, there is many other. But the Gita is given to Arjuna. And what makes Arjuna so special to receive the Gita is Number one, he's a man of action. He has not shunned action so far. It is action that prepares us to reach a point where we can receive the divine teaching straight and direct. So, if we like to withdraw from life, some people try to give Gita a completely inner symbolic significance. But that's not what the Gita is. The language itself, the beginning itself, where Duryodhana comes and describes all the warriors on this side, the other side, is not just of an inner symbol. There is an inner path. But the Gita is about real life, real action in real time. And it connects us so much with yoga itself, because yoga is not something which we do sitting for 2 hours in a meditation or, as a specialized procedure, but it cuts through the very maze and jungle of life. And what makes Arjuna specially fit for receiving the teaching of the Gita is the way he has met the challenges and shocks of life, neither shrinking from them, neither aiming at quick success. Of course, like any other person, he has his own, they are all egoistic, the Pandavas as well as the Kauravas. But what is special about Arjuna is that he must refer every action to a higher principle. That is something beautiful about Arjuna, and it's representative of a person who is really illumined in his mind. It's the sign of an illumined intelligence. There are two kinds of action, two ways people act. One is they act and think later. And the other is they think, they deliberate. They want to discern a principle. It's not that they act and justify the action. Arjuna wants a concrete justification for the act in which he is called upon to indulge. And this action is not something new to him, but here he faces a kind of inner moral, ethical, social, religious crisis where all the standards of conduct so far that he has, tried fail. And isn't it so true of our own life that there are moments when we reach a point where we just cannot choose? It's easy to choose between an apparent right and an apparent wrong, but very difficult to choose when the choice is between two apparent right. To fight a battle which is righteous, which has been thrust upon him, is right. To take lives of the opponents, that is also right. But equally, it is right to spare those whom he loves, whom he cherishes. These are the conflicts that Arjuna makes. This is the conflict that is going on within Arjuna. What is the standard of conduct with which we should lead life? And whoever has that question, and that question has come to him not in some intellectual wanderings of the mind sitting on an armchair, but that question has come to the person while engaging with the battle of life. Dharma Kshetra Kurukshetra, the field of unfolding dharma, all field of action. Kurukshetra is the field of the evolving dharma, as Sri Aurobindo puts it. So through action we grow, through action we evolve. And those who shun action are really not ready or fit to receive the teaching of the Gita. This is something so wonderful. It's not a monastic, there is of course a second Gita which was given much later. But even that's not a monastic Gita. It is given in the courts of Yudhishthira after the war. But this is the Gita. So this is the first thing that the Gita teaches us, that don't shun action. But does it mean that just to act blindly in our ignorance? No. It leads us from step to step to the highest possibility in action itself. And that's the beauty of Arjuna, that he's a man with a sattvic, rajasic disposition. So in the battle of life, we meet the challenge in three particular modes. As the Gita describes, there are the three gunas. And man meets the challenges of life in three modes of nature. First is the tamasic mode. Whenever he meets a challenge, his tendency is to be overburdened. Oh, this is too much for me. Oh, I am not fit. Let me accept whatever is coming my way. So this is the stage when one is like like a donkey bearing the weight of the world burden, and he is like a slave just moving here and there. He doesn't really fight. So he is afraid of fighting. He prefers to succumb, and in the process even break down, then take the challenge of life head on. Then there is the Rajasic man, the kinetic man. He loves to fight. But he fights mostly for his own egoistic pleasure, for joy, for dominate, to control, to possess, to expand. These are the kinds of the actions in which the Rajasic, egoistic man engages. And there is the third way of meeting the battle of life, and that is the Sattvic man, who basically wants to avoid fight, but not because of the Tamasic man, who doesn't want at all to fight because he doesn't have the nerves and the steel for it. But the Sattvic man who always looks for an illumined principle of harmony and order. Intrinsically, he may fight, but he'll fight for peace, for creating harmony. That's how Yudhishthira is convinced for the fight, because otherwise he wouldn't fight. He can fight, he's a Kshatriya, he's a good warrior. Yet he would not fight because he prefers harmony over, war and disintegration. So this is the three ways man meets the challenges of life. And Arjuna is the Sattvic Rajasic man. So he knows he's the highest type of humanity. And yet these standards fail him. There is no likelihood of harmony here. There is no likelihood of order here. And therefore Shri Krishna bids him to take the challenge and fight. But how to fight? Not through the modes of gunas of nature. Because they bind us, they hold us back. The Gita shows us a path of liberation through action. And that is something very, very wide. So all field of action can become a means for liberation. It is so contrary to, some of the monastic teachings where action is regarded as a bondage. And there also was a teaching based, unfortunately, on the Isha Upanishad, that, actions are necessary only till we are in the world. After we have withdrawn from the world, action is no more necessary. And that's why some people who come to the ashram, and of course Aurobindo, they're completely surprised, because when you go to an ashram, you expect a feeding place, bhojan bhandar, a meditation place where you sit for meditation, maybe a hospital where you are, if you are sick, you are looked after. But for all the rest, sit and meditate. And when you come to the ashram, or even more Aurobindo, you see multiple activities taking place. All life, all field of action is a means for evolution. This is the first thing that Gita brings in prominence. But if we act according to the mode of the three gunas, we'll be bound. But Gita wants to take us to a state of inner liberation through the outer action, and therefore it bids Arjuna to rise above the three gunas in a state where it's a divinely inspired action. So we have an action which is inspired by nature and acting through the ego. Even there, it is the divine who is hidden behind. But that action gets distorted in the process of transmission. Much like when the prime minister or president, I don't know how is it in UK, but everywhere more or less the story is the same, that an order is passed. By the time it comes back right to the point of implementation, there are many ifs and buts between the cup and the lip. Now the Gita teaches us how to reach to a state where the action is directly inspired by the divine, and it's when the divine action unfolds, it is not fixed into slots of papa and punya, sin and virtue. That's a human qualification, but it's an action which is necessary at that point of time for the progressive unfolding of the dharma or the world march. So the next step, the next thing that Gita teaches us is that, okay, fine, attuning to the divine, but why is the divine engaging in such an action? Why there is so much horror in the world? Sometimes, this is a question people ask, and because of that they shrink in recoil. Tamasic natures shrink in recoil when they see this aspect of the world existence. And Sri Aurobindo would tell us that if we shrink from world existence, we are not the adhikari for that grand vision of Shri Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where he reveals himself as time the destroyer. You see, this is something very unique about Indian thought, the Sanatan Dharma, that we have seen the divine even in destruction. Goddess Kali, she is the mother. Not that we are apostles of destruction, no, not at all. But if it happens, we see in her also the mother, the saving hand of grace. And that is itself a kind of compassion where this destruction frees the world march for its upward movement. So dharma in principle, there are two ways of looking at dharma, which is exactly what Arjuna is being asked to undertake, an action which is consistent with dharma, and through dharma it becomes a divinely inspired action. So this dharma is essentially, there are two aspects. One is something which is eternal and true. What is at the base of this creation of this world? There are those who believe that at the base of this world there is only desire and life is meant for enjoyment. That action is a non-starter, it is a dharma, because the very base is wrong. We may believe in some god and go to temple, that doesn't make a difference. If we believe that at the base of this creation there is desire, as the asuras believe, and therefore life is a field of enjoyment, we have really deviated from it. Is adharma, even if it be look like a very great action. There are people who may donate money to for religious purposes, go every day to a temple or a church. That doesn't make an action dharmic. It is still a dharma because the base is desire. On the other hand, what Sanatana Dharma teaches is that at the base of this creation there is truth. And this truth is not just something fixed, it is also unfolding through creation. And it is to this unfolding that we are called upon to participate. And this unfolding is always upward, towards wideness, towards light, towards freedom, towards unity, towards harmony, towards benevolence, toward the victory of good and truth over all that opposes it. So all that opposes, when mother was asked as to, mother, how to, it's not easy to know the divine will. She said, how to really act in this world. So she said, as a general rule, all that creates or leads towards unity, harmony, growth of peace, light, true love, all this is consistent with the divine action. And all that leads to its opposite, division, confusion, disorder, hatred, and the rest, all that is not a divine action. She said that as a general rule. So this is the first principle that Arjuna is taught to follow, that go along with the dharma. And always the dharma is unfolding through a struggle. Why? Because there are retrogressive forces which want to pull the world down, and their action is very deceptive. We know that during the Second World War, how Sri Aurobindo could see through the entire facade of Hitler, and though he was using the swastika as a symbol, and he talked about the Superman and the word Arya, and yet Sri Aurobindo said that this is a asuric force which is behind this man. And then he was asked that, don't you think that, do you really believe that the forces, allied forces, they are all nice, good people? He said, no. Even the Pandavas were egoistic. But their victory meant that the path of evolution of the world will remain open. On the other hand, if the Axis powers were to win, it would mean that the evolutionary path will be blocked and the world would go back thousands of years behind. See, this is the beautiful aspect of the understanding of the Gita. Now, even great people, idealistic people can miss it. Look at the picture of, a great man like Subhash Chandra Bose. No doubt great, fearless, and yet shaking hands with Japan and with Hitler. Because in his idealism, he could only see one aspect of the story, India. So whoever is the enemy of India, and as it is said in one of those Panchtantra tales, that the friend of, or the enemy of the enemy is a friend. And that's how he wanted to shake hands with Hitler. And Sri Aurobindo cautioned that it is dangerous. So this distinction between dharma and adharma is so subtle. What is really going to lead us towards a greater world, towards opening the path, towards light, freedom, immortality? And that's why we see the Kurukshetra war. War is a last option, but it is something real. It happens in life, in all our inner life and outer life. So Kurukshetra is at once within as well as outside. Sri Aurobindo makes it very clear. So though inner war we all know, all the time we cannot take one step forward in life without leaving something behind us. Without millions of creatures, call it microbes. Today, apologists for non-violence. I don't know what they have to say about the corona and, man's race against it. You have to fight. There is no way. This is an aspect of the world march and struggle. If you take at that point a stand that I am not going to kill any jiva, which is, of course, coming in the form of a virus. So we are literally exposing the world. I mean, whatever way we fight, inwardly, outwardly, is not the issue. It's not about vaccine or inner means. But war is a necessity of the world march. That's why we see that entire evolution of this world has been through war. Even when there is no physical war, there is war at the intellectual level, war of ideas, clash of ideas. Sri Aurobindo quotes Heraclitus, who says that through the war of ideas that fathers the universe. And if we look at entire, I'm cutting down the whole story, but if you look at the entire, somebody was the other day asking me that, now that the age of gods is over, Mother has spoken about it, but won't it lead to the, fall of religion? No, in India, if you see that it is through the clash and strife, all the gods of the Vedas went to an inferior position in the time of the Gita. Indra, who is a great god in the Vedas, suddenly Indra becomes relegated to an inferior position, which is Narayana, Vishnu, and Shri Krishna himself taking the lead. And now we are going beyond the gods. So this idea of dharma is an evolutionary movement, and any evolutionary movement will bring war. And wherever we are not willing to engage in that, that means we are paving the path for destruction. And that is what I must say, since it is contextual, that is what is happening to some of the religions which are not willing to evolve. They are stuck in a book and stuck in a founder, and that's the end of the story, because they are not ready to evolve further. And that's the beauty of Sanatana Dharma, that even in religion it has chosen the path of evolution. What was relevant 5,000 years back, you can't be fighting, for instance, today with bow and arrow. Times have changed, or wear a dhoti. So this is the way it evolves. So this is the second aspect. So there is the Arjuna, the representative humanity, who is ready to receive the Gita because he has not shunned the great battle of life. There is a very beautiful line in Savitri describing this whole thing, how man gets ready for this, reaching this point. And he says that about the master of the world, he says, our errors are his steps upon the way. One who has made this world is ever its Lord. Our errors are his steps on the way. He works through the fierce vicissitudes of our lives. He works through the hard breath of battle and toil. He works through our sorrows, our sins, and our tears. So this is how he works through. This is the process of evolution, where the downward forces do not leave us easily. And one has to struggle, one has to say no. That's why often I have learnt it the hard way, but I can always say that, one of the biggest challenges of life is to learn to say no. It's very difficult. At least was very difficult for me, I can say for sure. Very difficult to say no. And yet, can we really move forward if we don't know how to say no? To say no is empowerment. We are taught that to say yes is empowerment. To say no to all that is evil, to say no to all that leads us backward. That is a great. So there is a war. There are those who do not want this. And there are those who are representatives. So in this passage, it ends very beautifully. After we have served this great divided world, God's bliss and oneness are our inborn right. This is the qualification of Arjuna to receive the Gita. Gita's teaching cannot be understood, really speaking, sitting in a monastery and analyzing the slokas. One has to meet the challenge of life, not only within, but also outwardly. The second aspect is the Kurukshetra, the whole field of action of human life, including the terrible massacre to which a Kshatriya is called upon. In fact, the more greater the challenge, the more the evolutionary possibility. See, when the First World War took place and the mother saw the bodies and soldiers who came, some of them severely wounded, she was actually actively engaged in looking after them, so much so that she was taking it all on her nerves. And they got affected. So when she was seeing them, she said, because they have paid the price, these soldiers have gone and tried to make the ultimate sacrifice. And therefore, by this act itself, they become ready for the new creation. So this is the truth which has been distorted into that, blow yourself up and you will go to heaven. No, these are the soldiers who were fighting for saving the life of the world. And when we do that, opens the path. That's why in Indian thought, those who fought and died, they were called as given Veer Gati. And through this Veer Gati, the doors of heavens were opened for them because they gave the ultimate sacrifice of their even physical life, embodied existence. So even the physical war has its own place in the evolution of this earth and this creation. That's how one has to look at it. At the same time, it is at once an inner war where man is constantly looking for higher and higher standards of conduct. And this can apply in everyday life. When Meera goes through an inner crisis, another kind, because her husband and the family members, they want her to follow the Shakta Parampara, in which, you have to kill a buffalo and sacrifice and all that happens. Shakts are Shakti Upasak. And on the other hand, she is a Vaishnava, she is lover of Krishna in that form, not as the Chakradhari, but the flute player. And she cannot accept. Now she is torn in conflict between following the dharma of her in-laws or following her own lead. And a moment comes when divine grace, she has to leave the house and walk alone. I mean, we cannot imagine what the princess must have undergone. And she writes to Tulsidas, am I doing a right thing? Because, am I really doing a right thing? Shouldn't I go back and adjust with my in-laws? And Tulsidas, that famous letter of Tulsidas, Jaake priya na ram vaidehi, so chhadiye taji, koti bairi sam jadbi param sanehi. He gave the example of Vibhishana, he gave the examples of Bharat, he gives the example of Bali. For the sake of truth, one renounces Bali Guru Tejo, Bharat, Vibhishan, Bandhu Bharat Mehtari. They had to leave something with that power of renunciation. It's not something outward, but inner. Because one is impelled by the truth. And that first truth one has to follow is the truth within. So Gita speaks about the Swadharma, which is so central to the teaching of the Gita. Nowadays, when children grow up, we immediately want to put them in a slot. You will become this, you will become that. What is their Swadharma? What is it that they really, we may use a modern language, the angst within them, which wants to express itself. And that is the first lead that we are given. The second lead we are given is, along with that, is to keep track of the dharma in terms of the world march. And finally, the final lead comes when all this dharma through which we have evolved so far, we abandon at the feet of the divine, and then he says, Sarva Dharman Parityajam Mamekam Sharnam Raja. Then we become candidate for receiving the divine will. But the most important part of the battlefield of life and Arjuna's relevance is, we have not given him the title because he is the invisible king. And that is, no action upon earth can ever be complete without realizing and understanding that all action, the sole doer, the master of all works is the divine within. The Gita's people often ask, but we don't have a Krishna. Krishna is in all of us. Sri Aurobindo says he is the eternal teacher seated in the heart of man. And that's how Krishna reveals himself in the Gita. After the Gita, it's different, and before the Gita, it's different. But during the Gita, he makes it very clear that I am the one, the friend of all creatures who is seated within your heart. Very clearly, he reveals himself. And the mother describes this so beautifully when she was in France and she was given a copy of the Gita. She says a very poor French translation. But nevertheless, all that the person who gave her told her, Krishna is the immanent divine. And within a few months, she had realized the great teaching of the Gita. Just to know that the reins of her life ultimately are in the hands of the divine. And to consciously and deliberately hand it over. This is the image in the Gita itself. And the Mahabharata image is so wonderful that there are the steeds and there is the rein and there is the one who holds the rein, none else but the divine teacher. And there is the Rath and there is the Rathi, Arjuna. So this image is the image of our life. So the horses are the steeds. And if you don't apply rein to them, they will carry us. They are the senses. So the senses will carry us wherever, oh, I feel like doing this, I feel like doing that. That is a journey which the senses are taking us. Imagine sitting on a horse and the horse carrying us. He will, those places where you sit on a horse for, I think, 1 minute and the horse or the bull is doing all kinds of gymnastic and one falls. That is the example of not modern life, but a sense-driven man. You have no control because it's a machine. And that bull is making all kinds of gestures, you have to just hold on to or you will fall. So when we are driven by the senses, it's as good as or as bad as sitting in a car and putting it on autopilot. Nowadays we have cars. And then saying, okay, I am going to chill and relax. Where is the car going to? Wherever it feels like taking. Or telling the driver, you take me wherever you wish to. It's as dangerous as that. So the next is the reins, and the reins is the mind, the sixth sense. The mind should always be alert and awake, conscious, aware. Where are the senses taking me? Are they taking me to my goal or they are taking me away from the goal? So always to remember the goal in front. When we go through the battlefield and all the appearances are confusing. The mother gave a very beautiful thing that when appearances are very confusing, when you can't understand anything, then just remember divine is all. He is the all. And just call Ma, Ma, Ma. Why? Because then we are oriented correctly. There are moments in the battlefield when we don't know which way to go. And that time we must know that I may not know, my outer mind does not know, but you know, O Keshava, who is seated within the heart, where I must go. Take me to where I must go. And then to abandon the reins in his hands. So there is this mind which must be aware of what is the goal. The moment we forget goal, the Gita says that is being perishing. When we forget our very goal of life. So the mind holds the reins. And beyond the mind, there is the Shri Krishna. Now in the Gita's image, he is the Buddhi. The Buddhi discerns which way the steed should go. The mind must put a rein on them, Sanyama, and the Buddhi is the one which decides. And finally, we have the Arjun who is the Rathi, the soul. Soul is the one who is being carried in this journey. And what is the chariot? Chariot is the body. It's a wonderful image. And this image to remember that the body, is the significance of the body itself. In a battle of life, we cannot ignore the body. It's a chariot. It must be strong. It must be supple. It must be ready to take 100 assaults and yet not succumb. So this is the whole image that we see in the Gita. And the divine teacher, most important, who is within us. So Sri Aurobindo describes very beautifully the ways of dealing of the divine with humanity is typified in the relation of Arjuna and Krishna. So how is it typified? Normally the divine does not intervene. He allows the action to develop along a course and people feel that they are the doers of the action. And so long as this ego sense is there, that's how the action develops. But there are critical moments when there is a call that goes to the divine like an SOS and he intervenes. And we see, at least in the Gita, in Mahabharata, there are 3 clear moments when the call goes or the choice comes and the divine intervenes. One is when Draupadi, during the Chirharan, she calls the divine and he intervenes. The second is during the moment when Durvasa Rishi have come and they have been sent by Duryodhana, the scheming Shakuni, and Draupadi doesn't know because the Akshay Patra is over. And suddenly Krishna comes out of the blue because she's praying, help me, what do I do? He will, be full of wrath and curse us. And then Krishna takes a grain of rice and say, I am trapt. And the whole, Durvasa Rishi and all of them feel full. And the third is when before the battlefield, Arjuna and Duryodhana are given a choice. And it's a very interesting choice. It may look like a imbalanced choice. And this is the final message of the Gita. On one side is Sri Krishna unarmed, alone. And the other side is his Sena. After all, even those who oppose him are his army. What an interesting Chaturangini Narayani Sena. And what is special about Narayani Sena? They've been trained by Narayana. They are not ordinary warriors. They are the ones whom Krishna himself has trained in a way. And on one side he says, I'll be there. On one side there will be my army. And Duryodhana, the practical man, the pragmatic man. Both are pragmatic men. But Duryodhana, who is just looking for his own advantage, benefits, he says, I want your Sena. Whereas for Arjuna, I want Krishna unarmed. This incident, Sri Aurobindo has, of course, immortalized in one of his aphorisms. He says, if you have Krishna unarmed and alone on one side, and the world with all its shrapnel and everything on the other side, yet choose Krishna. This is a choice that we face every moment in life and the world. On one side is something which will give us immediate benefit, immediate advantage. On the other side is the will to do the will of God, to become his instrument, to become his channel, to express him, to manifest him. We don't know the means, doesn't matter. He will prepare us. He has prepared Arjuna not in this life, through lives. He has prepared him. And even in this life, he has prepared Arjuna through all kinds of tapasya. Arjuna has been, along with the Pandavas, banished. Then Arjuna has to do tapasya to get the Divyastra. And then Arjuna becomes a fit instrument. And the first thing that we have to learn to become an instrument of God is, as the Gita says, and Shri Krishna teaches Arjuna, that you are not the doer. You're just an instrument. I will do, because that is the eternal truth of our being which we don't know. So, when we go through the battlefield of life, constantly to refer, remember and offer, to refer every action to the divine within. We do not know what is good, not for success or failure, to fight with an equal mind, equal spirit, to rise above virtue and sin. Even that the Gita says. Through the rise beyond the intellectual notions of virtue and vice. Because very often they hold us back. The other day I was, sometimes this is a problem which specifically comes, in all parents, but in Hindu parents, there is a solution to it. Generation problems take place, and on one side, children want to grow beyond, and on the other side, parents. So we must listen to the parents, obey the parents. Sometimes, even if parents are obviously not saying or doing the right thing, I hope parents don't pass a fatwa on me. But nevertheless, this truth is truth. And so they say, isn't it written in our scriptures that you must listen to the parents? I say, I don't know. The last I read was teaching of the Gita, which doesn't say so. It says, if necessary for the sake of dharma, stand against the parents, the grandparents, the guru, everybody is included. So look at it. There is no outer standard of conduct but truth and truth alone. Because that is the saying of the scripture. In the end, it's truth that triumphs and not falsehood. Satyamev jayate nanritam. Satyena panthavitato devyana. So this is the great mighty teaching which liberates us from all trappings. We can't choose action purely by the intellectual mind. Of course, so long as we don't have a higher standard, then we use these things. They have their place. We have morality, ethics, all these standards are important as long as they are fulfilling their purpose and our egoistic needs. But a time comes when we want a greater truth, a greater principle. When we see that on one side there is our elders or whoever, they are asking us to do something. On the other side, there is evidently a greater truth. And then what we should do is follow the lead, the inner lead, which is leading us. And at the same time, remember and offer that action to the divine. Not for any personal gain. Certainly it is not an advice that, don't listen to others because of your own personal desires and gains. No. But it's about the unfolding of dharma. The only thing within, so in Indian thought, we don't find so much about papa and punya. That's a completely Christian conception. I'm sorry, but it's about vice and virtue. What it does is, the difference between this and dharma is that vice and virtue draw a line, black and white. This is sin, the seven sins. On the other side, there is all the good things. Now imagine somebody is standing on that entire left side column. He doesn't know how to leap to that right side column. So very often it leads to hypocrisy. We put up a facade of being very nice, like 2 generations before, children. They would smoke, but their parents had this idea that my child is, he's a wonderful child. So what they used to do, the moment they saw their parent, they would hide the cigarette behind. So it leads to hypocrisy. But now we have a different truth altogether, and that truth was in that saying of the Upanishad, Asado ma sadgamya. It's a journey. Black to white is not a switching over. Now you are through the green channel and now you get onto the side. No. It was a journey out of the non-being to the true being. Asado ma sadgamya. Tamso ma jyotirgamya. Through shades. This is nature. This is real life. There's not like suddenly there is a journey. We go through shades of grey. And then there is the emergence of the light. And mrityor ma amritam gamya. From death and complete denial of the divine being, we move to a point where we discover the divine being and are thrilled with that ecstasy. So when we understand it's a journey, in that journey we have dharma and adharma constantly coming to us. Dharma and adharma are not one column. It's not like all violence is adharma and non-violence is dharma. That's a completely Western conception of things. Violence can be dharma, as Kali and Shri Krishna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Violence can be adharma, as the asuras do it. Non-violence can be dharma, as the Buddha, mighty Buddha, walks and he inwardly masters himself, and discovering that inner immobility of nirvana, he gives a great teaching to the world. Non-violence can become adharma if somebody like Arjuna, a Kshatriya who is called upon to defend, being a champion of the righteous, called upon to defend the downtrodden, the people who are suffering, and the tyrants are on their back, and who says, no, I will not follow any violence because I have changed my surname and I have, I want to shave my head and walk into the forest. That non-violence will be a dharma. So very often people try to say Gita is a gospel of violence. It's neither. It's not about violence or non-violence. Dharma and adharma are not an action. Dharma and adharma are states of being. They're a terrible violence like the battlefield of Kurukshetra could be a tremendous dharma. And Arjuna has been immortalized. I'm sure Arjuna would have never thought, that time there were no televisions to take, thankfully, nobody took an interview of Arjuna. How do you feel after the war? And of course he said, I feel miserable killing all this. And of course Krishna's eternal smiles like a saving grace. But there would have been a lot of discussions. Arjuna is not following the teaching of the Sanatana Dharma. He's a violent man, wicked man. He should be banished. All this would have flashed with the liberal thought that Arjuna is somebody who is, not at all. He would have been confused. But history and time passes the final verdict. Arjuna continues to be the hero of mankind. He continues to be one of those heroes who engaged in a terrible massacre to save humanity through the Great War. So this is how we have to look at action. It's not about right or wrong. It's about the field of evolving dharma is Kurukshetra. What is right at one stage becomes wrong at another. And most importantly, it is there within us, within our heart. Nobody else can tell us. So we have to learn to tune into our inner heart, inmost heart, and come in contact with the immanent divine. This is the task given to man. Without the divine teacher, there is no relevance of Arjuna. There is no relevance of Kurukshetra. With the divine teacher, he could pick up anyone and turn him into an Arjuna, provided man has not shunned the great battle of light and lived with certain high standards. Sattvic man. That is the kind of humanity which is picked up by the divine to become his great instrument in the great world action. I'll close by reading just one passage from Essays on the Gita. So, It's a very powerful passage and it's so relevant at all times. Whenever we are called upon to battle, what we should remember. We are all the time remembering about this person, this hurt, that problem, all the cobwebs of the mind. Shri Krishna, when Arjuna is in a state of confusion, should I or should I not? And Shri Krishna, of course, says in the Gita as few slokas, but look at how Sri Aurobindo, I would use the word hyperpotensizes it. When Mother was asked about the Gita, she said, Sri Aurobindo has written in aphorism that the Gita will still liberate mankind. The mother added, and now with Sri Aurobindo's essays on the Gita appearing, its action has become much greater and manifold. And it's so true. Read this passage. It is the creed of the Aryan fighter. So, who is the Aryan? Aryan is a man who fights for truth and light and plenty within. Within also there is the war. To make sure that hatred, jealousies, all these fears, all these notions, they are kept in the, they are slain actually, calm the six band of spirits enemies. But also there is the battle outside. It is the creed of the Aryan fighter. Know God. First thing is to know God. It says, know thyself, know God and know who we really are. Not this conglomeration of body, cells, thoughts and some feelings. This outer personality we pride upon, this business card. We are none of these things. We are the eternal, immortal soul. And this should not be just an intellectual conception, but a discovery. Know thyself. Help man. This is the command given to us. But we cannot help man unless we know God and know ourselves. That is the other part. Otherwise, we'll be rushing into action like, as the famous saying goes, that fools rush where angels fear to tread. So one should be careful. Help man protect the right. Right with a capital R. This right is not just about right with a small L intellectual conception. The right is rith. Things should be according to a divine rhythm. Protect the right. Do without fear of weakness or faltering thy work of battle in the world. What will come to us as a result of all this battle? It may be the poison of the world, drink it like Shiva. It may be the Amrit, give it to the Lord to distribute it among the many. This is how Yagna is conducted. So he says, do without fear or faltering. Thou art the eternal and imperishable spirit. Thy soul is here on its upward path to immortality. Everybody is moving toward that great grand disclosure. This is another great teaching of the Gita. That look here, regardless, this upward current is so powerful. This is the truth of Vedanta. It's not like there is punishment and reward. These are very crude notion. The only reward, if any, is a growing closeness to God. The only punishment, if any, is a veiling of the inner Godhead. That's why the Gita says this God within is despised by the asuras. So what do the asura, how do they despise the God? When they drink alcohol and when they do all kinds of things. What are they doing? They are torturing the God within Krishna. With kama, krodha, fear, all this, they actually are binding him. Of course, Krishna will break free. Maybe with the death of the body, because he can slay and with full of compassion. He slays without stint and is full of compassion. But that's not the path man must take. Life and death are nothing. This is the great teaching. We can't fight the battle of life if we are always cringing for our own little survival. Survival may be the first necessity of the caveman, but it is not of the man who is rising on the crest of splendor. The high points of humanity are not about personal survival, but of the greater good. That's what maketh a man great. Thy soul is here on its upward path to immortality. Life and death are nothing. Sorrow and wounds and sufferings are nothing. I would say they are the Kumbh Abhishekam. Morning people do this Abhishek of Shiva with milk. And the Abhishek of a human being who is growing toward the Godhead is through these wounds, sufferings. They are the price he pays readily and happily. For these things have to be conquered and overcome. Equanimity to be really an instrument of the great world action as Arjuna is. Look not at thy own pleasure and gain and profit. This mentality cannot earn us God. It may earn us some tinsels, but to really put our names in the list of the divine will, we have to get rid of this mentality of what benefit I will get. People even turn to God saying that, what are we going to get out of it? So divine would say supramental. No, 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 that we don't want. Will I get my next promotion? Divine may say, well, you may lose it. If- don't say this, sir. See, this is what I did to the Pandavas, you remember? They were banished into the forest. Sir, you are being very dangerous. This divine I don't want. I want a divine who fulfills my wishes. God would say, then you are looking for a genie in the bottle, not for God. So that's not how the divine acts. So what we should look at, but above and around, above at the shining summits to which thou climbest, around at this world of battle and trial. You know, this shining summits to which one, it reminds me of one of the poems, is it Jaishankar Prasad? Himadri Tung Shranga se prabuddha shuddha bharati, swayam prabha samujjvala swatantrata pukarti. Sri Aurobindo writes it in Invitation. I am the spirit of freedom and pride. Stark must he be and a kinsman to danger, who shares my kingdom and walks by my side. The shining summits. This is nothing. What is happening in one lifetime and few things, this is nothing. The real thing is the summits of glory, divine glory, which is the crown of our existence towards which all human nature, all human beings are climbing. Around at this world of battle and trial in which good and evil, progress and retrogression are locked in stern conflict. Men call to thee, their strong man, their hero for help. Help then, fight. Destroy when by destruction the world must advance. And sometimes this destruction can be something very seemingly small. You know, Champaklalji used to wear a janev. And the mother once asked him, do you want to wear it? He said, no, mother, I don't believe in it, but because, my parents will feel bad. Mother kept quiet for a while, then said, maybe if you remove it, they will evolve. There is another example of Sri Aurobindo. See how divine beings don't act according to our mental notions. So Amrit Dai is that time Tamil Brahmin, and he is there, he comes a young lad, 15, he's coming to meet Sri Aurobindo, and often he would stay back in his house, and he's sleeping. One day Sri Aurobindo calls Subramanyam Bharati, and Nalida, and tells him to do a surgery without anesthesia. What is that surgery? Is to remove the choti. Night, the choti is removed. Clean, and he doesn't know. Morning when he sees his face, then he's shocked. He says, my father is going to meet me after 2 days. What will he think of me? Sure enough, the father came. And he said, oh my God, I had seen a girl for you. And now I can't show my face, let alone. I had promised, but such a child with no choti. You are a lanchan on the Brahmins. But that Amrit Da was destined to become a person whom the mother said, the one and only, the first and last manager of the Sri Aurobindo ashram. Mother's words. She said, there will be none like him ever after. So when we shed the past, we emerge into the future. And if we hold on to the past for the supramental life, Mother said only 2 things are needed. Do not cling. And second is the thirst for progress. It doesn't matter where we are, what we are doing. See that if you have this thirst for progress and you do not cling, then even the extravagances of an American youth are a path. So this is the battle which goes on all the time. But at the same time, but hate not that which thou destroyest. Don't let hatred and all this come. They are hatred, jealousies are emotion which kill the person who harbors them first. So without hatred, because it's the thing to be done. Know everywhere, neither grieve for all those who perish. Little more difficult, but still. Know everywhere the one self. As Sri Aurobindo says in one of his poems, my rival's downfall is my own disgrace. I look at my enemy and see Krishna's face. So success and failure were never in the original script of God. This is the mind that came in. Oh, success and failure. It is to play the game and grow. Play it well. It doesn't matter if you lose or win. Play it well. This is not a consolation for Indian team. But nevertheless, play well. Then you lose, it's no problem. People who play well and then they lose, you're fine. But when you play miserably and lose, you say, what's the point of the game? Play well. Play your best. Give your best and then it doesn't matter. Know everywhere the one self. Know all to be immortal souls and the body to be but dust. Do thy work with a calm, strong, and equal spirit. Fight and fall nobly, or conquer mightily. This is the great Indian civilization. Fall nobly, or conquer mightily. For this is the work that God and thy nature have given to thee to accomplish. So I'll put a pause button here. If there are questions, I'll be very happy to.
Thank you very much, Bhai, especially by ending with what you read from Essays on the Gita. Thank you so much. I have a question to start off with, please. You mentioned that Arjuna had been prepared through lives to the point where we end up in Kurukshetra and Krishna's narrating everything to him. Would the same be true that we also are being prepared through lives and have been prepared through lives?
Exactly. So there are two kinds of, if I may use the word souls, but it has been used like that. And the mother has used that there are two kinds of souls who are, there is a point up till which all souls move in a similar way. But there is a kind of souls which can be called as weak souls. These are her words, and they have to be qualified with the intrinsic sense within it. So the moment they face the great battle of life in any form, they begin to shrink and shun. And there comes a time when they want to escape from all this Jagat Janjal, as they call it, World Wide Web, its English translation. And they want to escape because they cannot understand what this battle is about. They declare that this world is incorrigibly wicked, that it's the field of some mysterious Maya, Kala, Titan, or darkness, whatever term. And this duality in which they live, they say, this world is not God's, but my soul can be freed from its clutch and go to God. So there are souls like that who want to escape from the world play. They cannot become instruments of God. But there are those, and the mother has said they are heroic souls. They plunge themselves into even this darkness. As Sri Aurobindo says, if there is darkness, all the more reason for children of light to be there. If there is the field of death, all the more that we come there and reclaim our immortality. So all of us, or let me put it like that, the large chunk of us, the large chunk of humanity is fortunately imbued with this fighting spirit. And this humanity is being prepared to be the instruments of the divine over a period of time. It's not suddenly in one day, but if we take that, and who knows, the grace can work mysteriously. It can shorten the action of lives into a single lifetime. That's what yoga is about. So, and there can be no greater felicity than to be an instrument of God. I mean, merger with God is the complete identity, is the next greater thing. So yes, it's the story of everybody. Like Savitri and Satyavan. Satyavan is all of us. So Arjuna is, in a sense, all of us are nascent Arjuna. But the difference is, we may take the road of Karna. Easy way to fame. 7 steps, spiritual practices for quick success. Now that's a different path altogether. But if one wants to be Arjuna, one has to follow this path that has been shown by Shri Krishna in the Gita, that you have to live for that which is true, good, noble, high, great, always to the summits. And not only individually, but to help mankind in that collective march. Such a person who doesn't shun the battle of life, goes through it with complete trust in the divine and in the eventual fulfillment of the destiny of the race. That's what he says, that eventually all of us are on that great disclosure of immortality. Such a soul is prepared and becomes an instrument of God. Yes, we are all Arjunas in the making.
Yes, thank you, Alok Bhai, for such a wonderful and enlightening session. One question that comes to my mind is, in Mahabharata, I remember one incident when just before the battle, Sri Krishna asks Arjuna to pray Mother Durga. Is there any other mention of the Divine Mother in Mahabharata or even in Arjuna or Pandava's life? I mean,
well, the Divine Mother does come in various ways, but the most significant one is the incidents where you mention, because ultimately See, Sri Krishna himself is Kali on the battlefield. And he says in so many words, if we go into the Mahabhagavat Puran, he is Kali who has come as the form of Krishna. But nevertheless, this worship of the Divine Mother, which comes before a battle, is because she carries the victorious mandate from the Divine. So ultimately, even if God is on this side, one must make sure that that power of the divine is on the side of the battle which seeks to win the war. Of course, she will not be with the dharma, but nevertheless, even in Ramayana and Mahabharata, both places, in the before the battle, this incidence, this worship of the Divine Mother comes. But not otherwise, because it's only for the battle that she is invoked as the victorious power and the protection aspect of the Divine Mother. So we find it in Mahabharata in this way. But Draupadi herself is an incarnation of the Divine Mother. It is also there in the Mahabharata. In fact, there is a very interesting story about her being the incarnation of the Divine Mother. Radha is an incarnation of the Divine Mother, though of course she is, mystics doubt whether she is a mystic creation or, but that apart. But regarding Draupadi, this is a clear story in the Mahabharata that she is an incarnate Divine Mother, that Bhima is suddenly sees a dream. He's wondering, he wants to kill, but a momentary doubt crosses his mind also, like Arjuna. But Bhima is Bhima. He doesn't want all this complicated answer that there are three gunas, there is all this. He wants to know, will we win or we won't win? So with that idea, he goes into sleep and he sees in his vision that there is a big courtyard where all the warriors are seated and all the four brothers are seated, and then comes Krishna, and then there is a throne which is still empty, and there he sees that Draupadi comes, and she is all like Mother Kali. She comes, and as soon as she comes, he thunders, "But where is Bhima?" And instantly Bhima comes out of his trance and falls from a pedestal on the ground. Then he recognizes that she is none else but Mother Kali, and she herself has come to make sure that the Kuru clan is destroyed, because this was a mission. So there is the embodied divine, the incarnate divine, which is so wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you. And in Ramayana, Sita herself, Ma Sita herself is the Divine Mother, really.
Yes, there is a whole Ramayana called as Adhyatma Ramayana, which is seen from Sita's perspective. So, she's asked that how could Ravana take you? Even in the Ramayana, Valmiki Ramayana, it is there. Before the Sita Haran, Sita and Rama, they come together and say, now the time has come for our earthly Leela. So Sita says, all right. So she gives herself to fire, meaning thereby she veils herself and she becomes Avidyamai. That is how Ravana could come near, and she says, go after the Maya Mrik, because she has assumed that form. But why she went with Ravana was to convert him. Because Ravana, somewhere that love is there. After all, he is Jai Vijay. Her, they used to take care. So she goes all the way to Ashoka Vatika to convert him. That maybe one day, but he doesn't. And in the end, it is Sita's presence that destroys him. If you see the Adhyatma Ramayana, in fact, in the end of the war, whatever Rama does, all of them, come back mysteriously, and in the end she takes the form of Kali and destroys, because she has the ultimate mandate. Yes, she is the Divine Mother. So that's why we don't see so much of the worship outside, because the embodied divine, when he is present upon earth, that we see in Ramayana and Mahabharata, and now of course with Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, then that takes care of everything. This also Sri Aurobindo brings out in Essays on the Gita, that while Krishna is the embodied divine, but when the immanent divine, but when that immanent divine stands in the forefront, comes as an avatar, that is a very special moment. Then all other things go into the background. Even the gods bow down. That's why you see Indra and all coming down and bowing to Krishna. And it reminds me of something very interesting in the Essays on the Gita, if I may indulge for a moment. In Essays on the Gita, Sri Aurobindo says the inner fruit of the avatars coming. See, this is about the mystery of the avatar. Embodied divine, which is very different from these powers and aspects. The inner fruit of the avatars coming is gained by those who learn from it the true nature of the divine birth and the divine works, and who, growing full of him in their consciousness and taking refuge in Him with their whole being, man mana mam upashrita, purified by the realizing force of their knowledge and delivered from the lower nature, attained to the divine being and divine nature. Mad bhava. The avatar comes to reveal the divine nature in man above the lower nature, and to show what are the divine works: free, unegoistic, disinterested, impersonal, universal, full of the divine light, the divine power, and the divine love. He comes as the divine personality, and in the end, he says that nor does it matter essentially in what form and name or putting forward what aspect of the divine he comes. For in all ways, varying with their nature, men are following the path set to them by the divine. Whatsoever way we love and take joy in God, in that way God accepts, loves, and takes joy in man. So this is the mystery of the avatar. When the avatar is here upon earth, then all else fades into the background, because it's the supreme divine taking a human body. That's what we see during the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And that's why Sri Aurobindo reminds us again, turn to the mother. That contains everything. Nothing else is needed. Because it's the embodiment. And embodiment is even greater than the divine in that impersonal universal state. Because this embodiment helps matter to be redeemed. Mother goes on to say that just by having faith that the divine incarnated in matter, you can be redeemed. Because just to know that the divine touched matter, the Supreme is there, always. But the worship of the Supreme does not transform matter. There has to be that mediating power. And that mediating power is the avatar. So, yes, definitely, incarnations, embodied divine, during such moments is something wonderful. It's the greatest moment upon earth. Something which is non-replicable.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alok Bhai.
Thank you. Do you have time for one more question?
Yes, of course.
Anybody have a question? Okay. You mentioned, I think, 2 or 3 times that the Pandavas were also egoistic, just as the Kauravas and all that. And so much of our sadhana and integral yoga is all about dissolving the ego. So how does that reconcile in terms of the field of life?
So, often we take a division, as I said, a strict division between those who are egoistic and those who are non-egoistic. But it doesn't work like that, because then the non-egoistic category will be minimal. So, Sri Aurobindo reminds us that the difference between a sadhaka and a man of ordinary life, to start with, they start from the same point. But the difference is that the sadhaka, because he has taken a journey, started a journey, he will come out of this maze of ignorance, while the other person is still happily, munching the grass there. So this is the difference. That ego is required at a stage of evolution, without which we will become a prey to world forces. Ego serves a purpose. Nothing in this humanity is without a purpose. So if prematurely we get rid of the ego, it is like, the mango which has not yet become ripe, to use Sri Ramakrishna's analogy. It is good only for pickle. So when we meet the challenge of the world forces, we need the ego. But instead of being a tamasic, rajasic ego, it should be a sattva rajasic ego, where you are standing up for something which is noble and high. And then there comes a time, first we discover the true self, then the ego self becomes an instrumental personality. It changes, it doesn't vanish. It becomes an instrumental personality through which the divine can act. But we don't identify anymore with it. So, that's why people who really have gone beyond the ego, they don't say, this body that is called this. No. They will still use the word I. Sri Aurobindo has used the word I. Mother has used the word I. And because naturally, they say that I, which we think that I has become an instrumental personality. But ego is no more dominating or leading. The final dissolution of the ego comes only to the Paramdrashta, one who has seen the Supreme. Below that, there is some ego which remains like a thin veil. And Sri Ramakrishna has used a very nice analogy. He said it's like, it becomes so thin, it's like line drawn on water. So it melts and comes forward. Especially bhaktas like to keep a little bit of it, a thin sliver of the ego. That's how they enjoy the relation with the divine. So in a yoga which is world transforming yoga, the integral yoga, We have to go through all these stages. In place of the ego, the first thing is to discover the psychic being and identify with it. Now, there will be moments when instead of the psychic being, we'll get into this frontal personality and we may confuse. Not confuse, because once you have discovered, one can never lose that. But for a moment, we may act under the impulsion of the outer personality. Then again, we step back. Slowly in this process, we are constantly identified with the psychic being within. That is first liberation. But this doesn't liberate us still from the clutch of the ego. Because still there is an angle. Psychic being still acts according to an angle of vision. Final liberation comes when we are freed from the entire field of nature and its workings. And that's what is described in Savitri as the cosmic consciousness, nirvana, and the all negating absolute, where one is completely freed from the field of nature, what is called as realizing the divine self with a capital S. So that is not something which is as easy as it seems. So when Mother said, tell the ego its hour is gone, she is referring basically to this tendency of human nature to act under the stress and impulsion of the ego personality, the surface man, the outer personality. That's what she is reminding us. That complete liberation from the ego in the mystic sense, highest sense, the dissolution of the ego. In fact, if it happens prematurely, it's not even desirable. Because then one can even, there are people who have gone completely crazy. Sri Aurobindo speaks of that, who have dissolved the ego prematurely, and then their nature, because what does ego do? Ego chooses. This is right, this is wrong, I take this, I don't take this. So it makes one suddenly a football, which is kicked by all the forces of nature. So Sri Aurobindo says, if you prematurely break the shell, then your nature can become pishachvat, unmattvat, balvat. All these things can happen, jadvat. Just sitting, without, because normally it is through the ego that the choice takes place. And it can be in a state of danger. So it is better to choose without preference, to act without desire, to offer the fruits of action, and then take the journey so that the ego becomes thin, and one day it just vanishes without realizing that, oh, my ego is gone, because that itself is an egoistic, idea. So it must thin out, and when it is ripe, it will automatically go away. We don't have to worry about it. Our focus should be on discovering the divine and make sure that the crudeness, the egoism, that is not there in nature. Vanity, pride, this feeling that I am the doer, this arrogance, all this should go away. This is dangerous. So it's ambition, these manifestations of the crude, rajasic, violent rajasic ego, that must go away. That's what he explains to, Shri Krishna explains to Arjuna in chapter 16, the Devasuri Sampada. Whereas, let the ego become more sattvic, more malleable, and open to the divine. Ego is that I identify with my sattvic nature. No. This nature also belongs to the divine. So by constantly remembering and offering, a time comes when this becomes very thin and then eventually vanishes. That's how it should go. It's a journey, process.
So we'd like to thank you once again on behalf of Auromeira Center for joining us. And I believe we are meeting again very soon for our next topic.
Yes,
so
we'll
thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Alok.
Namaste.
Namaste. Namaste.